Napoleon Bonaparte, the military genius who rose to dominate Europe, was known for his bold strategies and groundbreaking victories. But even the most brilliant leaders have their downfalls. And for Napoleon, that moment came with his disastrous invasion of Russia in 1812. This campaign, which he called the Second Polish War, was supposed to be a swift and decisive victory. Instead, it turned into one of the greatest military disasters in history, largely because of the brutal Russian winter and his overconfidence. By 1812, Napoleon was at the height of his power. He controlled much of Europe, but his ambition knew no bounds. One of his biggest challenges was Russia, whose Tsar, Alexander I, refused to fully comply with Napoleon's continental system. A trade blockade designed to weaken Britain. Frustrated by this defiance and eager to assert his dominance, Napoleon decided to invade Russia. He believed a quick victory would force Alexander to submit. What he didn't anticipate, however, was the sheer scale of the Russian resistance, or the harsh environment that awaited him. Napoleon amassed an army of around 600,000 men for the invasion, the largest force Europe had ever seen. Known as the Grande, it was a multinational force made up of soldiers from across his empire. With such a vast army, Napoleon was confident that his campaign would succeed. But from the start, there were warning signs. The logistics of feeding and supplying such a massive force were almost impossible. As the army marched into Russia in June 1812, they faced a hostile and unforgiving land. The Russians, knowing they couldn't match Napoleon's forces in a direct confrontation, employed a scorched earth strategy. This meant burning their own villages, crops and supplies as they retreated, leaving nothing for Napoleon's troops to live off. Every step forward for the Grande Armée brought more challenges. Food became scarce, morale plummeted, and desertions increased. The vastness of Russia itself became a weapon. The further Napoleon advanced, the more stretched his supply lines became. Despite these challenges, Napoleon pressed on. His first major objective was the Russian city of Smolensk, which he captured in August. But instead of engaging Napoleon in a decisive battle, the Russians continued to retreat. Finally, in September, the Russian commander, General Mikhail Kutuzov, decided to make a stand near the village of Borodino, just outside Moscow. The Battle of Borodino was one of the bloodiest of the Napoleonic Wars, with tens of thousands of casualties on both sides. Although Napoleon claimed victory, it was a hollow one. The Russian army retreated, but it wasn't destroyed, and Napoleon's forces were too weakened to fully capitalize on their win. Napoleon then marched into Moscow, expecting Tsar Alexander to surrender, but when he arrived, he found the city largely abandoned. To make matters worse, the Russians had set much of Moscow on fire. Instead of finding supplies and shelter, Napoleon's army found a smoking ruin. He waited for over a month, hoping Alexander would negotiate, but the Tsar refused. Napoleon now faced a dire situation. Winter was approaching, and his army was stuck deep in enemy territory with dwindling supplies. By October, Napoleon had no choice but to order a retreat. What followed was one of the most harrowing episodes in military history. The Russian winter arrived early, bringing freezing temperatures, snow and ice. Napoleon's troops, many of whom were poorly equipped for the cold, began to die in droves. Frostbite, hunger and disease took a devastating toll. Soldiers who had once been part of Europe's most powerful army now huddled together for warmth, their uniforms in tatters, their spirits broken. The retreating army was also relentlessly harassed by Russian forces and local militias. Cossack cavalry, known for their speed and ferocity, launched hit-and-run attacks, picking off stragglers and cutting down anyone who fell behind. The Grande Armée, once a symbol of Napoleon's unstoppable power, was now a disorganized, desperate mass. Men abandoned their weapons and supplies just to survive, and discipline collapsed. One of the most infamous moments of the retreat came at the Berezina River in November 1812. Napoleon's army needed to cross the river to escape, but the Russians had destroyed the bridges. Under heavy fire, Napoleon's engineers managed to construct makeshift bridges, allowing some of his troops to cross. However, thousands were left behind, either drowning in the icy river or being captured by Russian forces. By the time Napoleon reached safety, his Grande Armée was a shadow of its former self. Of the 600,000 men who had marched into Russia, only around 100,000 survived. The rest had been killed, captured, or had deserted. Napoleon's reputation as an invincible leader was shattered and his empire began to unravel. The invasion of Russia marked the beginning of the end for Napoleon. Within 2 years, his enemies had united against him, and he was forced to abdicate in 1814. So why did Napoleon fail? There are many reasons, but they all boil down to overconfidence and underestimating the challenges of invading Russia. He didn't account for the vast distances, the harsh climate, or the determination of the Russian people. His supply lines were overstretched, his army was unprepared for the winter, and his strategy of relying on quick victories fell apart when the Russians refused to play by his rules. Napoleon's Russian campaign remains one of history's greatest cautionary tales. It's a stark reminder of the dangers of hubris, the unpredictability of war, and the power of nature to humble even the mightiest of armies. While Napoleon is remembered as one of the greatest military leaders of all time, his invasion of Russia is a sobering example of how even the most brilliant plans can crumble when faced with the harsh realities of the world.